gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Katherine Carter today. And today, of course, is the 150th anniversary since the birth of Winston Churchill at Blenheim Palace. Now, Katherine, both you and I work in buildings, and you actually live in a building that was incredibly special to Winston Churchill. And you've written this amazing book, which I can't recommend enough, and which you have some wonderful news about, which I'll ask you to share in a moment. But could you just give people an idea? Who are you? Why are you here? What do you do?
I'm Katherine Carter, and I am the curator of Winston Churchill's family home at Chartwell in Kent. And I've been there now for around 11 years and have also had the extraordinary pleasure of living on site as part of my role there for a time. But I'm also a historian and author, and my new book, Churchill's Citadel, is out now. It came out at the end of September, and I'm delighted to say has been doing rather well so far. It's the first book of its kind, looking at Churchill's life through the lens of his home at a vital time in his life. And so, yeah, really excited to be here.
And what was the little snippet of news regarding your book that you shared with me earlier today?
Well, yes, as of the time of recording, it had reached #1 in its category on Amazon. So that category being post 1901 British biographies. So I am absolutely over the moon. As you can imagine, some very tough competition in a rather crowded field of all biographies of individuals since 1901. So I really am over the moon.
No, congratulations. I think that's fantastic. So, Katherine, there are so many books about Winston Churchill. I mean, so many books. Why is yours? How is yours different?
By using Chartwell as the stage on which events play out, there's no other book about Winston Churchill that approaches his life in that way. But I think, as well as Chartwell being so important to the story of Winston Churchill's life, it also opens up opportunities to tell stories of individuals and events and just what everyday life was like in a way that very few historians have considered in any detail. So I love the instances where you have, for example, there's a great story where Lady Churchill is inclined, for whatever reasons, to hire maids from Wales. And they would understandably come out to rural Kent and find themselves rather homesick. They don't know anyone there. It's very remote, and they often don't put down roots and leave quite quickly. And so their secretary at the time, Grace Hamlin, thinks, okay, how about it's a very modern approach. I'll consider retention strategies in order to not have to keep recruiting. And one of the ways she does this is by trying to ingratiate these maids in the local community to give them a sense of sort of rootedness and desire to stay, which included taking them to the nearby village of Westerham and out to local dances and that sort of thing. And one of my favourite stories was an instance where Grace had brought the maids who lived on site at Chartwell back in her car after the dance, but it was clearly a little bit later than planned and all the doors were locked. So you have this remarkable recollection from Grace years later, remembering having to help give these Welsh maids a leg up through an open window in order that they could try and get in below the radar and not wake anyone up. And I think that it's stories like that that just make you realize that there is this entire community that orbits around these country houses. You know, the stories of the families who lived there are obviously hugely important ones, but those maids at that point in time, their lives orbited around it just as much as the Churchills did, which included, when needed, climbing through windows, apparently.
So, what prompted you to start on this book, and when did you start on it? What gave you the initial idea?
I've had an idea of writing a book about Winston Churchill's life, but through events that took place at his country home for quite some time. And for me, there has been a real risk in some of the historiography around Churchill at this point, whereby Chartwell is often conveyed as this sort of scenic backdrop. to historic events. You know, it's a place he would go to relax and to paint the beautiful views and feed the fish and all that sort of thing. And I would read these and think, well, yes, that is absolutely true. But it was also his factory of words, where he wrote more than William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens combined. But also, more importantly, it was the epicenter of his campaign against Nazi Germany over the course of what he called his wilderness years, over the 1930s. And so I really wanted to put Chartwell as centre stage, and do so through looking at meetings that took place. So these remarkable conversations, as a result of which the course of history was changed. But they're very little known, these meetings, and it's been through an extraordinary amount of research over the course of about 4 years, of more archives than I can count, that I've been able to unearth these gems of accounts of how these meetings went and what happened as a result.
And it's interesting. You've mentioned Chartwell, and it almost becomes a character in its own right. I felt. Um, what were your thoughts when you first came to Chartwell, when you started to work there? Was it always an ambition of yours, or did it just happen like so many of these things do in life?
From almost my earliest memory, am a very long-standing history geek. It's been my passion for, since childhood. And so I was always fascinated by the past and what happened. And I remember my particular association with Winston Churchill arose because a birthday that I had, which was the 50th anniversary of VE Day. And I remember thinking, gosh, this seems like a lot of bunting and celebrating. I'm pretty sure it's not just for my birthday. I didn't have sort of delusions of grandeur at that age. So I remember asking my dad, who studied history at university, please tell me more about this remarkable occasion which, everyone is celebrating today. And quickly forgot about my own birthday, became so enthralled by this remarkable story of this individual who had led the British government through the course of the Second World War and celebrating victory even half a century on. And so political history especially has been a very long-standing interest of mine. I studied at university, and then I did a master's in museum and artifact studies, which then in due course found me rather perfectly of running Winston Churchill's home, which now I've been there for 11 years. It's definitely somewhere I'm very happy. It's meeting a lot of my interests, and I feel incredibly fortunate to do what I do.
So you mentioned that, the book is set in the 1930s, and you mentioned that Churchill described these as his wilderness years. So can you just set the scene a little bit? What had happened to him?
Winston Churchill, in the sort of first half of his political career, had a variety of different cabinet roles, including reaching the heights of both Home Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer, two of the most senior offices in British politics. However, in 1929, an election took place where he was successful in retaining his seat in Epping, so he remained a member of Parliament. However, his party were defeated and he found himself on the opposition benches. And he essentially used the extra time he had, among other things, to give lectures. And he went over to the US in 1929 and unfortunately made a pretty catastrophic error by investing or starting to invest and speculate in stocks, which for those of you listening who can imagine that it's probably the worst point in history to start speculating on the stock market. And the Wall Street crash results in losses to his personal finances of just shy of £1 million in today's money. So at this point, he needs money fast. Writing has always been his main source of income. So he largely retreats to Chartwell. He doesn't have to be at Westminster quite so much because he's on the back benches, but he needs to write and he needs to increase his productivity dramatically. So he starts writing a multi-volume history of the Duke of Marlborough. So his ancestor, of course, who listeners to the Blended Palace podcast will be very familiar with, I'm sure. But this takes him, a great part of the decade to write. Antonio, you mentioned that Chartwell was like another character. I think the biography of Marlborough is almost like another character in itself. It's sort of always there in the background. And it was on this trip that he undertakes as part of the research for the Marlborough biography in 1932 that he, in Germany, starts to witness what he later calls a war mentality. And pretty much from that point on, he begins to sound the alarm of concern about the Nazis, who at that point were the largest party in the Reichstag, but Adolf Hitler only became Chancellor the following year. But from as early as November 1932, he's making speeches warning about what he has seen in Germany. And as the decade wears on, it becomes sadly more and more apparent that the Nazis have ambitions around territorial expansion. But there is so much recent trauma from the First World War, understandably, in addition to a fear that another war, if it was to break out, would involve much more war in the skies and potential aerial bombardment of civilian populations. So with the recent memory of the First World War, the horrors of what a future war might look like, you have a lot of people campaigning for peace at all costs, essentially, really putting their heads in the sand about the fact that the Nazis are rearming. And so Winston Churchill, from as early as 1932, ignores these appeasing voices and desperately tries to campaign for rearmament as a deterrent of war, actually, not because he wants war, but because he wants to prevent it, but also collective security and alliances in order to kind of, safeguard Britain on the world stage through alliances. So that is what is playing out over the 30s. It's his writing at Chartwell and these meetings that he needs to glean information to support that campaign against Germany, because he can't just go into the House of Commons and say, I've got a bad feeling. He needs information and intelligence and numbers and testimonials, anything he can to prove that the argument that he's making is right.
You just reminded me of something that I happened to hear on the radio on the way into work one morning, and Churchill was a very keen cinema goer, or who loved films, etc. And I hadn't realised until quite recently that he was a script writer for Alex Korda, who was a Hungarian director in this country. And in the 1930s, Alex Korda produced a film, I think it was called The Secret Life of Henry VIII. And Churchill wrote a bit of the script for it. And it's where I think Henry VIII or his advisor is saying, we must build ships, ships and more ships. And it really resonated. And I thought, you can tell that's Churchill, just, and in a way, I suppose that's what he was saying, wasn't it? That we needed planes, we needed ships, etc. So yeah, that just struck me. The other thing that I was thinking of course, you mentioned the rise of the Nazi Party, and there was a moment when Churchill and Hitler almost met. Do you think it would have been different if they had met and Hitler hadn't underestimated this gentleman?
Yes, the remarkable near miss, as I call it, is the introduction to my book actually begins with this incredible sliding doors moment in history where a dinner is arranged by other parties, I should add, a combination of Adolf Hitler's kind of social secretary, a gentleman called Ernst Hemstegel, who knew Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's son, and the two of them think, we really think that, Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill should meet, because Adolf Hitler at that point is the rising star of German politics. It's very easy for us to look back with all that we know and be horrified, but actually Winston Churchill was someone who was always interested in meeting people with different political perspectives. And of course, the horrors of what awaited under the Nazi regime, nothing like that had started to unfold by that point. In my opinion, I don't think them actually meeting would have changed the course of things that dramatically, because even though Adolf Hitler essentially stood Winston Churchill up, which is, again, astonishing to think about, but Winston Churchill was seen by quite a few people at that point as having passed the peak of his political career, whereas Adolf Hitler, rising star in Germany, as I've said, too busy for the likes of a backbench MP who's, past his prime. And so Adolf Hitler doesn't arrive. But from the accounts, both from Winston Churchill and Hemstegel, There are a number of criticisms that Winston Churchill makes of Adolf Hitler. So, actually, what is likely the case is that Winston Churchill would have used that meeting as an opportunity to sort of, interrogate Hitler over dinner about some of his policies. So I can say with relative certainty that that's how it would have gone. There would have been a lot of questioning about his policies, anti-Semitism being one that Winston Churchill was voicing concern about to Hempsteadle. So I don't think that the outcome of history would have changed dramatically had they met. And I think if in fact it would probably have solidified Winston Churchill's views of Nazism and Adolf Hitler even sooner and even more firmly.
Right. Okay. Well, we've touched very briefly on I mean, you've 4 years researching and writing this book. And of course, you have that wonderful quote at the beginning or end, I can't remember now, and do forgive me, about what Churchill said about writing a book and how it progresses from, being quite gentle and quite nice to being all-consuming and yeah, a bit of a monster. So where did your research take you? And, what did you uncover that really knocked you for six and thought, wow?
Well, my research took me all over the world, although because quite a lot of it was undertaken during the pandemic, I was very fortunate that a number of archives, particularly in the US, made their archives remotely accessible. Or in some instances, there were researchers who one could hire to go through the paper files for you and then forward you their findings. So there were workarounds that were discovered in the pandemic, which really, in a way, enabled access in quite a new way. So that was really exciting to be a part of. Um, there were also the likes of oral history interviews. So some of my most wonderful recollections that have been weaved in were by the secretaries, who fortunately the Churchill Archive Centre had undertaken a number of interviews with, I think in the 1990s, of individuals who were there in the 30s, just remembering what life was like and remembering the combination of, the strain they were under, the late nights. Another source of invaluable recollections was correspondences. So I didn't actually rely that much on secondary sources at all. I wanted to go straight to the voices and the words of the people who lived through this. So I think my book, when you read it, there's a sort of immediacy to it because you
Yeah.
are seeing it through their lens of what's happening at the time. And I think I would just add that my absolute most exciting moment of research was the result of sheer online stalking, by which I managed to find the last surviving pre-war resident of the Chartwell estate who was there in the 1930s. A wonderful lady called Gwen. She's still with us. I got an email from her the other day. She's brilliant. And she was born in the gardener's cottage in 1928 and lived at Chartwell till she was 16. So she has genuine recollections of things like, the staff Christmas parties and her big sister helping Winston Churchill bricklay, and really amazing, rich textured details of what life was like. So yes, there is the high politics, there's the geopolitics, there's the meetings, the diplomacy, the pressure, the policy being discussed, but there's also, what gift the head gardener's daughter got for Christmas, so, and also the families' lives. It's such an extraordinary tapestry of
Yeah.
what Chartwell was like.
And I think you've hit the nail right on the head. And one of the things I love about this book, which again I think makes it so readable for such a wide audience, is the fact that you've got all sorts of things going on in the background. So you've got Churchill's daughter eloping with Victor Oliver. You've got the meeting with Churchill and Vic Oliver, which didn't go well, and right down to him sending off for maggots from Yorkshire for his cold north. And I just love those details. And as I say, but as you said, quite rightly say, it just paints this picture of what life was like at Chartwell. Now, and again, you've led me to another question, really. So, given that you have these accounts, first-hand accounts of what it was like there, and what it was like to work for Churchill. What sort of an employer do you think he was?
I mean, I think a tough employer. If there was one secretary, a lady called Kathleen Hill, who was the first of their resident secretaries. So she actually lived in a room in the house itself, in the very top floor of the house. And she was theoretically meant to have a sort of afternoon break. So she was meant to start at 7 a.m. And do two shifts, one of which would go through till the afternoon, and then she'd have a few hours off, and then she'd start early evening and work through till 2, 3 in the morning, which is a tough enough working pattern as it is. But actually, that afternoon break most of the time didn't happen. So she would be up at 7, finishing at 2, climbing the stairs to her room on the top floor, getting maybe 5, 6 hours sleep at most, and then starting again. And I think that it is, I don't think anyone can hear that working pattern and think, oh, that sounds easy. So the people who worked for the Churchills were extraordinarily dedicated. There's another secretary called Mrs. Pearman, who at one point writes to an agency looking for another job, and she declares, I don't see my family anymore. I don't see my
I
friends.
remember her kind of
Yeah,
saying that she had enough.
yeah. You kind of feel for them, but the thing
Yeah,
is, they stay. There's something
yeah.
about that working environment and the importance of their work. And also, the Churchills weren't the best employers in terms of pay either. They were probably at the lower end, which when you look at the financial situation the family were in, which at times in the 1930s was on an absolute knife edge, you can kind of understand. But their staff wouldn't necessarily have known about the intricacies of their financial difficulties and just thought, gosh, I'm not getting as good a wage as, my friend who does the same job in a different estate. But they stayed because there was something about Chartwell and the contribution each of them was making to the running of that place, to the supporting of the family, that just meant they had the most extraordinary loyalty out of a lot of their staff. So I think to work for them would be tough. You'd need to be thick-skinned. You'd probably need to cope on very few hours sleep, much like Churchill himself, but it would be an extraordinary place to be. And I think to be even a fly on the wall at Chartwell at that point would have been, an honour. So to be there would have been, yes, absolutely phenomenal, I think.
Which is probably why people like you and I work in the heritage sector.
Yes, absolutely. I think the idea of seeing history through places, I think is such an important thing because you're you're in the places where history was made.
Yeah.
And how remarkable that we can then reflect on the fact that the world is different today because of things that happened in these buildings. And I think that's such a privilege that our roles afford us.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that springs to mind, and again, you talk about it in your book, is the relationship between Winston Churchill and Edward VIII, and then when he abdicates with George VI. And there was a weekend in Blenheim in June 1936 when, there they all were. And again, coming back to your book, and the people that visited Chartwell, I would love to, like I would love to have been a fly on the wall or a member of staff if necessary. And we'll come on and talk about some of the individuals, but how on earth did you narrow it? How did you set about not filling this book with 500 people?
That's a really good question. Truth be told, when I first came up with my list, and you're absolutely right, there could have been hundreds.
Yeah.
My first sort of whittled down list was 28. Uh, and I showed this list very proudly to a number of people, including several of my sort of writing mentors. And they all looked and they went, no, don't do it. You can't do a 28 chapter as your debut book. That's ridiculous. So I went away and I thought, okay, if I had to distill it down to the ones that correlate most perfectly with what's happening in the wider geopolitical climate, there are some natural ones. So, there is a gentleman who's visiting from Vienna who shortly after Nazi troops find themselves in Vienna. So there are some that were too perfect to not include for the insights they gave Churchill. But I'm delighted to say that all 28 of them did work their way in somehow, even if it was just a momentary name check. I couldn't quite say goodbye to them, but the 12 I have picked really are the creme de la creme, in my opinion, of those meetings.
But you see, that to me says that, like Churchill with his Life of Marlborough, there's going to be a volume two a volume 3 and possibly even a volume 4, which is no bad thing. Um, Out of those 12, who would you most like to have to dinner?
Oh, do you know what? It's a really tough one because when I was writing the book, every single chapter I thought, this is my favorite. And then I'd write the next one, this is my favorite. And so happened through all 12. I think even if there were no guests, to have dinner with Winston Churchill alone, even if, it was just him on his own and I sort of popped in to join him, that would be great. But if I had to pick one of the 12 meetings, I think the idea of sharing a dinner table with Winston Churchill and Albert Einstein, it's too good. Oh, but then Lawrence of Arabia as well. Oh, do you know what? I can't pick one. They're all too good. But the great thing is each of them is extraordinary in some way. They really are. I mean, the fact that you've got the Chinese ambassador coming a couple of weeks before war breaks out, when Winston Churchill is still a backbench MP, and the insights that are being brought by him and the gentleman he brings with him, it's just, it makes the sort of, hair on my arm stand up just thinking about it sometimes. And yeah, I can't pick. I'm sorry.
But I think what's also surprising reading that, given the world we live in today, is that China was such a close ally in those days.
Well, at that point, Japan had invaded and subjected China to essentially an undeclared war. War wasn't
Yeah,
actually declared at that point for some point, but they were living in conditions that were
yeah.
essentially that of a war. And there's a number of articles that Winston Churchill writes, sort of, in support of China, which is why the ambassador's visit takes place. And in effect, not to do too much of a spoiler, but the result of that meeting is that the Chinese ambassador, Kuo Tai-chi, becomes an intermediary between Winston Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek, who is, the head of the Chinese government at that point. And again, Churchill's a backbench MP. So for there to have been that incredible transformational change between 1932, this lone voice opposing Nazi Germany, to world leaders essentially sending representatives to Churchill's country home to try and, get his ear on the subject, I think just shows the transformation of what Chartwell and what these meetings allowed Winston Churchill to achieve over that decade.
But I do, and again, I do think it's an intrinsic part of Churchill's character, though. And again, I've seen it in things that I've come across at Blenheim. And I think it was in 1910 when he was a member of Queen's Own Oxfordshire Hussars, and they had a camp at Blenheim. So they had all these exercises, etc. And there's a quote saying, I told the general to do blah, 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 blah. And it went awfully well. And you just think, everyone else may have thought he was a backbencher, but that's not what Churchill, that's not what's going on in his head, And I suspect that having spent a lot of time researching Marlborough, you almost become that character. And so his ancestor was this great leader. Of course he was. It's no surprise at all, I don't think.
I have absolutely no doubt that the writing of Marlborough influenced Winston Churchill's thinking at that point. I mean, his knowledge of history generally was phenomenal,
Yeah.
but to have been looking at the life of Marlborough and Marlborough's response to a tyrant in Europe, and then seeing what was playing out as well in the 1930s, it's impossible not to think that parallels were being drawn at that time. And I think Winston Churchill, it's that perfect combination of his early military career, his extraordinary knowledge as a historian, and his political acumen that puts him in such a strong position. And it is really because of, as I mentioned earlier, the horrors of the First World War being in recent memory and this desire to avoid war at all cost that see him being ignored. But it is those components that mean he has this extraordinary basis of knowledge on which to then gather the information that he does at Chartwell and make the campaign that he does.
You mentioned one of his guests, Lawrence of Arabia, and he was quietly told to drop Churchill, because it wasn't seen as being a desirable connection. How do you think Churchill would have reacted to that?
I think, in a way, Churchill would have enjoyed still being talked about. I think the thing is, Churchill is someone who is, you know, uh, his knowledge of things like the power of your name still being out in the world. If he was a completely spent force in politics, then there would be no need to make that statement. It's the fact that he still has a role to play, which is perhaps the cause of concern. I think, in a way, there's a recognition in that statement being made. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think he'd have been jumping for joy that his friend was being told to stay away. But there is something interesting where maybe he's onto something. You know, there must be a sense by that point that he's got a point actually, and he's making a strong argument, because otherwise, why would you go out of your way to try and keep people apart who might otherwise bring value to each other through the friendship and the information they can bring?
I think that's a fair point, and it's like the no publicity is bad publicity.
Exactly.
Um, okay, so Einstein, however, refers to Churchill, who, let's not forget, didn't excel at school, as an eminently clever man. Now, if Einstein were even to look in my direction and say anything favourable, I would be delighted. How do you think Churchill would have responded to that praise? Would he have thought it was his due, or what do you think?
I think he'd probably have rather enjoyed it. I mean, Albert Einstein at that point is probably the most well-known scientist in the world. He's already won a Nobel Prize by that point. He is someone who is globally recognized. He already, even by that point, has that sort of iconic image, and he's probably one of the most well-known individuals in the world at that point. But he's well known in a particular area, e.g., the sciences, that isn't something that Winston Churchill has an extraordinary knowledge himself of. And in fact, Winston Churchill relies heavily on his friend, Professor Lindemann, a professor at Oxford University, when discussions around applied science take place. So actually, someone with a knowledge so specific to an area that isn't Winston Churchill's strength, but still reflecting back that he's a clever man, I think Winston Churchill would have taken that quite proudly.
What's the, again, just thinking about the guests that you write about and who are included, was there anyone that you were surprised didn't visit Chartwell, or anyone to your knowledge that was invited but turned down the invitation? I mean, I know things didn't go terribly well with Kennedy, for example. Was there anybody else?
So the Kennedy chapter, you're absolutely right. I have included in there in part because it is a meeting that didn't go well. And I think if I only included meetings where Churchill got the absolute outcome he was hoping for, that wouldn't be a fair depiction of Winston Churchill in the 1930s. He would have come to power and influence far sooner if he'd got his way every time he had a conversation at his country home. So the Kennedy one is an instance where you have two individuals who just straight off the bat do not trust each other. I mean, Winston Churchill has hopes for something out of that friendship, but Kennedy, I should say, certainly doesn't trust Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill fails to get the message across that he hopes. So that's a failed one. In terms of individuals, I'm surprised, or I was surprised, I couldn't find any reference to a meeting of Anthony Eden. Probably would be
Oh,
one where I was just quite surprised. But they were, of course, seeing each other relatively often in London. So there might not have necessarily been a need. I think the way to look at Chartwell is, if you want to have a meeting and you want to be away from the prying eyes of Westminster, you don't want it to be known necessarily that you're seeing Winston Churchill. That is the context of a lot of these meetings. And often they are individuals who history hasn't necessarily, recalled, but the meetings did change the course of history. So there's a gentleman called Ewald von Kleist-Schmenzen, who comes essentially as a representative of a number of distant German generals who want to overthrow Adolf Hitler. So his life is at risk by undertaking the mission he does to try and secure support from British politicians if these generals were to overthrow Adolf Hitler, because he has to go back to Germany with the intelligence and the information he's got. So, of course, that is a meeting that you want to take place with no risk of anyone seeing. So that's what Chartwell is as well. It's this remote, private location where Churchill can have these meetings away from places where the ears have walls and prying eyes.
I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind who's listening to this how important Chartwell was to Churchill. And you mentioned there kind of precarious finances. And there was a time when they invited, I think it was an estate agent or a land agent that's still in existence today, and said that they were open to people viewing the property with a view to buying it. Where on earth would they have gone, and what effect would that have had? I know Clementine didn't like it quite so much, and I believe Churchill bought it without her knowledge to start with. What would have happened?
It's a very good question, and I have had a few people say to me, "Do I think that had you transplanted Winston Churchill and his family and his staff into a different place, would history have been the same?" I don't think it would have been. I think Chartwell was so perfectly positioned in being less than an hour from Westminster, remote enough for privacy, but near enough to villages you could get staff. There were so many things where the stars aligned perfectly because it was Chartwell. And you're absolutely right that there was a moment in the winter of 1937 to 38 where an agent was brought in, a sales brochure was made up, copies of which do still survive, which is brilliant because it means we have photographs of the rooms from that period, which is, as a historian, an absolute gift. And there were a number of viewings that took place. Winston Churchill couldn't bear to be there when they happened, though. He would often make himself scarce, and understandably so, because that would have been heartbreaking for him, I'm sure. So had they had to sell Chartwell, they would have lost this incredible resource in terms of this remote idyll where they could have these secret covert meetings. So it might well have been that Churchill's campaigns might have been negatively affected by the lack of intelligence statistics being brought to him, by the lack of kind of these conversations he could have by which he could persuade people to come around to his way of thinking. I think it probably would have weakened that campaign. But having said that, Churchill, with, the courage that he had, I'm sure would have endeavoured nonetheless to continue with his campaign. I don't think he would have downed tools on it because of having to sell Chartwell, but it might have well have affected the momentum or the efficiency by which he was able to mount that campaign.
And again, a thought occurs to me. I wonder if he would have used Blenheim. Until 1934, his first cousin was the ninth Duke. And then also from 1934 till the start of war, the 10th Duke, who he was very fond of. And, Blenheim could have served. We weren't open to the public in those days. There was that house party with Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, etc. And I just wonder if he would have, I know it's just kind of speculating, but I just wonder if he would have used Blenheim in the same way that eventually he used Ditchley Park during the Second World War. Again, they each have the characteristics of Chartwell in that they're away, they're secluded, etc. It's an interesting thought.
It is an interesting thought, and the truth is we'll never know what might have happened. And unfortunately for Winston Churchill, events managed to unfold in a way where he was able to keep his house. But I think there's so much that was dependent on him and Clementine having complete control of all the variables in order to get the best outcome. So even down to the fact that, the cook that Clementine hired, when, the former French Prime Minister came, there was, exquisite French food that was ready. There was so much thought, but it was all made possible because it was Winston and Clementine's household, and they had sort of complete control over everything. The dining room chairs being according to Winston Churchill's specification, so people wouldn't want to leave the dining table. There's so much about Chartwell that is so them that I struggle to see how it would have sort of transplanted into another location and been equally effective. But I suppose we'll never know.
So again, just going back for a moment to the guests, and we've named a couple of them, but I don't want to talk about the content of the book, as it were, because I want people to go out and buy it and read it. But I was surprised that there was only one lady. Now, is that because you chose her from a number of ladies, or was she the only lady that visited during that time?
So, do you know what? At the outset of this book, I would have loved it if there had been a plethora of ladies whose visit there and their direct conversations with Winston Churchill changed the course of history. That was a sort of criteria of me selecting the visitors. And there are ladies visiting during these meetings. So, for example, when Joe Kennedy comes, he brings Rose. So there's a number of instances where there's ladies at the table, but with my criteria being history would have been different were it not for this one individual coming. Sheila Grant Duff really did sort of, shine particularly brightly in order to reach that kind of level. So she was a cousin of Clementine's, but she's also a foreign correspondent who, by that point in the mid 1930s, is specialising in Czechoslovakia. And she, during her time in Prague, has this extraordinary ability to befriend and become confidant to a number of very senior political figures. So she has information that she can bring to Winston Churchill at Chartwell that no one else can bring. And that is the sort of criteria by which I selected the individuals. She is a truly remarkable individual who is able to, at one point, she's being essentially given messages indirectly from Czechoslovakia's president that then go to Winston Churchill. So there's plenty of women visiting, but Sheila is extraordinary in that I would argue that history would have been different without her.
So Churchill builds up this huge, huge amount of information, but sadly, war still breaks out. So how was he then able to use this in a positive way? How was he able to use the information he'd gathered? How was he able to put it to good use?
So before war breaks out, the sort of practical application of this information being brought to Chartwell, whether it is information about estimates of German rearmament, whether it is accounts of the productivity of armaments factories, whether it is individuals' testimonials about the terror being inflicted on German citizens, or the citizens of the Austria and Czechoslovakia in due course. He is able to use them through a variety of mechanisms. In some instances, they are woven straight into his speeches. In other cases, they form the basis of articles that he's writing, desperately trying to sound the alarm of Britain's need to prepare for war. And I should say that Winston Churchill's campaign in favour of rearmament was much more as a deterrent. He hoped that Adolf Hitler would be deterred from undertaking his campaign of territorial expansion if Britain had rearmed effectively in time. So I'm always keen to sort of stress that point. And then he would also use it in meetings with colleagues in Westminster as well. So, for example, the former French Prime Minister, a gentleman called Pierre Flandin, comes to Chartwell with French estimates of German rearmament. So Winston Churchill is able to take those numbers to a meeting in Westminster and say, there is this difference between Britain's estimates and France's estimates. The reason for this difference is, X. And as a result, we need to recalibrate our understanding. So there's a wide variety of ways that he's able to use this information. But the crux of which is, come September 1939, when Britain declares war on Germany following its invasion of Poland, Winston Churchill has by this point for 7 years been making this case. He is almost unique in having the knowledge and authority on the subject of Nazi Germany, which is what sees him being brought back into government in September 1939. And in due course appointed Prime Minister in 1940. It's easy to forget there wasn't an election in 1940. He was simply appointed. But the fact that that transition was as easy as it was because Winston Churchill was so clearly the man with most understanding of the Nazis' regime and their ambitions as well.
They're definitely the man for the job.
Most definitely.
Sadly, coming to the end of our time, but I want to return to Chartwell. And how did Chartwell become part of the National Trust? And were there any special obligations? And I'm kind of talking with a view to perhaps introducing your house guest.
Yes. So I'll answer the question more broadly about the how the National Trust came to have Chartwell first. So in the winter of 1946 to 1947, So the Second World War has by this point ended. Winston Churchill is no longer Prime Minister, but he is leader of the opposition. And there are conversations happening about Winston Churchill possibly having to sell Chartwell. And there are a huge number of people who think this is an absolute travesty. You know, Winston Churchill, who in the eyes of many at that time had just saved Western civilization, having to sell the home that it was so widely known was, as I said earlier, you know, a second love of his life after Clementine. And so a group of individuals clubbed together and bought Chartwell, but legally sort of gifted it to the National Trust at that point, so just after the Second World War, but on the condition that the Churchills could live there for the rest of their lives. So at that point, the National Trust owns it, but the Churchills are still living there and continue to do so until Churchill's death in 1965, at which point Clementine could have carried on living there. But she actually thought, do you know what? This is a big house to be in on my own. I actually prefer London life. I like the theatre. I like fashion. I will head to our London house, but I will help the National Trust to prepare Chartwell for opening. And what an extraordinary gift that is, because most houses that come to the National Trust do so after a period of decline. There is a reason they're being given to the National Trust. You know, perhaps some of the, you know, the maintenance costs aren't being kept, or they're having to sell some of their possessions or whatever it may be. Chartwell is extraordinary in that it comes to the National Trust at the absolute peak of its importance and significance. And so to have the Churchills, in terms of Clementine, Winston's widow, and Mary, their youngest daughter, working hand in glove with how to ready the house for opening is this truly extraordinary thing. There were a number of requests made by the Churchill family, as you alluded to earlier, Antonia, including that we always have a cat at Chartwell to represent the cat that Winston Churchill got for his 88th birthday, called Jock, because he was named after Sir Winston Churchill's Scottish Private Secretary, Jock Colville. And Jock is a marmalade cat with 4 white paws and a white bib. So forevermore, we have a cat meeting this very distinct criteria, living on site at Chartwell. We currently have Jock 7 is the one that we're up to at Chartwell. Jock 6, however, is still very much alive and kicking, and in fact lives with me here at my home near Chartwell. He took early retirement because he sadly lost his sight, which was making it rather tricky for him to get around, and understandably, lots of people being very excited to see him was rather stressful for a cat sadly losing his sight. So Jock 6 lives with me here. He's taken early retirement. He's very much enjoying it and country life with me in our cottage. And then Jock 7 has the glorious role of greeting a couple of 100,000 visitors every year at Chartwell.
Do you know that I love that story? And can I just say, we also have a Jock at Blenheim in
Do
Church
you?
Yes,
I didn't know that. That's brilliant.
but but it's a kind of little model of a ginger or a marmalade cat called
Oh,
Jock.
I didn't
And
know
it's
that.
a story that I love to tell our visitors. And I'm so pleased that you're on Jock 7 because I think that's the one I've been telling them about. But I will tell them now that Jock 6 is also still with us.
Yeah, Jock 6 is enjoying the quiet life.
Lovely, good, and long may that last. Katherine, it's been an absolute delight. And again, I can't speak highly enough about your wonderful book. Congratulations. And everyone, go out and buy it, go and read it, and you'll love it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me, Antonia. It's been great fun. Thank you.